I always thought my life with Emily was a quiet masterpiece, painted in soft hues of routine and trust. We'd been married for 12 years, living in a modest house on the edge of town, where the trees whispered secrets to the wind. I'm James, a man of simple pleasures, coffee in the morning, a good book at night, and the steady hum of my job as a carpenter. Emily was my anchor, a woman with sharp green eyes and a laugh that could melt the coldest day. She worked at the local library, surrounded by stories, and I loved how she'd come home with tales of quirky patrons or dusty old books she'd unearthed. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, or so I believed. It started with a flicker, a tiny crack in the canvas of our marriage. Emily began staying late at the library, claiming they were digitizing records. An endless task, she said. I didn't mind at first. I'd cook dinner, leave a plate warming in the oven, and wait for her to breeze through the door, her hair slightly mussed, her cheeks flushed from the evening chill. But the late nights stretched into weeks, then months. She'd slip into bed long after I'd fallen asleep, her scent faintly different, something earthy, like cedar or smoke. I chalked it up to the library's old wood shelves or her new perfume. I didn't ask. I trusted her. Then came the day I found the note. It was tucked inside her coat pocket, a coat I'd grabbed to wear when mine was still damp from a sudden rain. A scrap of paper, folded tight, with handwriting I didn't recognize. Asterisk, meet me at the Grove. 8 p.m. bring the blanket. Asterisk, my stomach twisted, but I told myself it was innocent. A friend, a coworker, a surprise she hadn't told me about. I decided to test it. That evening, I kissed her cheek as she left for her late shift, then followed her. She didn't head to the library. She drove past it, out to the edge of town where the forest swallowed the road. I parked far behind, headlights off, and watched her disappear into the trees. The Grove was a place we'd picnicked years ago, a hidden clearing where sunlight dappled the grass. I crept closer, my boots silent on the moss, until I saw her. Emily, my Emily, spreading a blanket on the ground. And then he arrived, Tom Harrison, the town's butcher, a broad-shouldered man with a laugh like a chainsaw. I knew him. We'd shaken hands at the market, traded small talk about brisket cuts. Now he was here with my wife in our place. They didn't see me. I stood frozen as she smiled at him. A smile I hadn't seen in years, and they sat together, too close, their voices low and intimate. I didn't confront them. Not then. I stumbled back to my truck, my chest tight, my mind a storm of disbelief. The woman I'd built my life with was unraveling it, thread by thread, with a man who carved meat for a living. I drove home, sat in the dark, and waited. When she slipped in at midnight, humming softly, I pretended to sleep. But I wasn't sleeping anymore. I was awake, wide awake, and something cold was growing inside me. The next morning, I watched Emily over breakfast like she was a stranger wearing my wife's skin. She buttered her toast, chattered about a new shipment of books, and kissed my forehead before leaving for work. Her lips felt like a lie. I nodded, smiled, played the part of the oblivious husband, but my mind was elsewhere. Replaying the Grove, Tom's hulking frame, the blanket. I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't unfeel the betrayal sinking into my bones like damp rot into wood. I needed proof, something solid to hold on to before I let the storm inside me break loose. I started small. After she left, I rummaged through her things. Her purse, her desk, her car. Nothing obvious at first, just receipts and library cards, until I found her phone charger plugged into the bedroom wall. She'd forgotten her phone that day, a rare slip. I hesitated, then powered it on. No password. She'd always said she had nothing to hide. I scrolled through her messages, my hands trembling. There it was, a thread with Tom Harrison. Asterisk, last night was perfect. Same time tomorrow. Asterisk, her reply. Asterisk, can't wait. Bring the wine. Asterisk, my vision blurred. I set the phone down, walked to the bathroom, and stared at myself in the mirror. The man looking back wasn't James anymore. He was someone harder, someone waking up. I didn't stop there. I drove to the library, parked across the street, and watched. She wasn't digitizing records. She was laughing with patrons, shelving books, then slipping out the back at 6. I followed her again, this time to a diner on the highway. Tom was there, waiting in a booth, his apron still stained from the day's work. They shared fries, leaned close, her hand brushing his arm. I sat in my truck, gripping the wheel until my knuckles ached, and took photos with my phone. Grainy, but clear enough. Evidence. A map of her deceit. That night, she came home late again, claiming exhaustion. I cooked her favorite, roast chicken with rosemary, and asked about her day. She spun her usual tale, her voice light, her eyes avoiding mine. I nodded, poured her wine, and watched her drink. She didn't know I'd slipped into her world, that I was collecting pieces of her lie like a carpenter gathering nails. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my workshop, surrounded by sawdust and tools, and let the cold thing inside me sharpen. Revenge wasn't a word I used yet, but it was forming, a shape in the dark. The next day I called in sick and went deeper. I visited Tom's butcher shop, pretending to buy ribs. He grinned, chatted about the weather, offered me a discount. I smiled back, my face a mask, and studied him. His thick hands, his easy confidence. I wondered how long it had been going on, how many times he'd stood in my place. I bought the ribs, left, and drove to the Grove alone. The blanket was gone, but the grass was flattened where they'd been. I sat there, breathing the cedar air, and let the truth settle. My wife had chosen him, and I was the fool left behind. Days bled into weeks, and I became a shadow of myself, moving through our life with mechanical precision. I cooked, I worked, I kissed Emily goodnight, but inside I was carving something new. A plan, a reckoning. I couldn't confront her yet. Not until I understood the depth of her betrayal. Not until I had every splinter of it in my hands. I kept following her, mapping her secret life. The Grove, the diner, a motel on the edge of town with peeling paint and flickering neon. I saw them there once, her car parked beside his truck, the curtains drawn. I didn't need to see more. I knew. I started digging into Tom, too. He was a widower, his wife gone 5 years from cancer. No kids, just a small house near his shop and a reputation for charm. People liked him, customers, neighbors, even me once. Now I saw him differently. A thief, a vulture circling my marriage. I watched him at the shop, at the bar he frequented, at the Grove with Emily. I took notes, photos, timestamps. I built a dossier, a quiet obsession that kept me sane while the world I'd known crumbled. Emily noticed something was off. "You're quiet lately," she said one night, her head tilted, her green eyes searching. I shrugged, blamed work stress, and she let it go. She didn't push because she didn't want me to push back. She thought she was safe, that her double life was invisible. But I was seeing everything now, and the cold thing inside me was growing teeth. I didn't just want her to hurt. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done, to lose something she couldn't replace. I tested her once, casually mentioning Tom. "Saw him at the shop today," I said over dinner. "Nice guy." Her fork paused midair, her smile flickering. "Oh yeah, he's friendly," she replied. Too quick, too bright. I nodded, sipped my beer, and filed it away. She was nervous. Good. I wasn't ready to tip my hand, but I liked knowing I could rattle her. It was a small power, a taste of what was coming. At night, alone in my workshop, I started sketching, not furniture but ideas, ways to unravel her world. I thought about public shame, about confronting Tom, about leaving her with nothing. But those felt too simple, too quick. I wanted something lasting, something that would echo in her bones. I didn't know what yet, but I knew it would be cruel, a mirror to the cruelty she'd shown me. I sanded wood until my hands bled, letting the pain ground me, and waited for the shape to emerge. By now, I was a ghost in my own home, haunting the edges of Emily's life. She didn't see it, didn't feel the shift, because I'd learned to wear the mask well. I smiled at her jokes, held her hand at the market, even planned a weekend hike like we used to. She thought we were fine, maybe better than fine, and that made my resolve harder, colder. I wasn't just gathering evidence anymore. I was studying her, learning her weaknesses, her habits, her lies. She was a book I'd read 1,000 times, and now I was rewriting the ending. I expanded my watch to Tom. I learned his routines. Shop open at 7, closed at 6, drinks at the Rusty Nail on Fridays. He was predictable, a creature of habit, and that made him vulnerable. I started talking to people, casual chats with his customers, his bartender, his neighbors. "Tom's a good guy," they'd say. "Always got a story." I smiled, agreed, and tucked away their words. I wasn't after gossip. I was after leverage, something to twist when the time came. I found it in his past. A rumor of a gambling debt, hushed up years ago. Small, but a crack I could widen. Emily's lies grew bolder. She'd invented a book club now, Thursday nights at the library, but I knew it was a cover for the motel. I followed her once more, saw the same scene, her car, his truck, the curtains. I didn't linger. I drove home, poured a whiskey, and sat in the dark, thinking. The betrayal wasn't just the act. It was the ease of it, the way she'd woven him into our life while I slept. I wondered if she loved him, if she'd ever loved me. The questions burned, but they fueled me, too. I started planting seeds, subtle things, testing her guilt. I'd leave my phone out, open to a photo of us from years ago, and watch her glance at it, her lips tightening. I'd mention the Grove in passing. "We should picnic there again," and see her falter, her excuse flimsy. She was unraveling, thread by thread, and didn't even know it. I liked that. It was control, a quiet power building under her feet. In my workshop, the plan took shape. Not confrontation, not yet. Something bigger. I thought about her pride, her image, the way she glowed when people praised her at the library. I thought about Tom's shop, his steady life. I could take those things, break them, leave them both with nothing but the wreckage. I sketched late into the night, the sawdust piling up, my hands steady. Revenge wasn't a word I said aloud, but it was there, a heartbeat in the silence. A month into my silent war, I hit a turning point. Emily came home one night, her eyes bright, her voice too loud, and I smelled the wine on her breath. She'd been with him, I knew it, but she babbled about a library event, a donor party. I nodded, poured her water, and watched her stumble through her story. She was getting careless, sloppy, and that was my opening. I didn't need more proof. I had enough to bury her. But I needed the perfect strike, something that would cut deeper than words or tears. I shifted focus to Tom. I tailed him to the Rusty Nail, sat in a corner booth, and listened. He bragged to the bartender about a special lady. His grin wide, his hands gesturing. I sipped my beer, my face blank, and memorized every word. He didn't name her, but I knew. I started digging into his shop, public records, health inspections, anything I could find. There it was, a violation from 2 years back, a fine he'd barely paid off. Small, but a thread to pull. I called in a favor with an old friend at the county office, asked him to look closer. "Just curious," I said. He didn't ask why. At home, I tightened the screws. I left a library book on the counter, one I'd checked out myself, with a note inside. Asterisk, "Missed you at the Grove." Asterisk, she found it, froze, then laughed it off as a prank from a patron. But her hands shook, and I saw the fear flicker in her eyes. I kept my voice light, my smile warm, and let her stew. She didn't sleep that night. I heard her pacing, the floorboards creaking. Good. Let her wonder. Let her doubt. I visited the Grove again, alone, and sat where they'd been. I imagined her laughter, his touch, and let the cold thing inside me roar. I didn't want to end it fast. I wanted to dismantle them, piece by piece. I thought about her job, her sanctuary. I thought about his shop, his pride. I could take both, twist them into something unrecognizable. I drove home, the plan solidifying, and spent the night in my workshop, sketching not with pencil but with intent. By morning, I knew the shape of it. Not a shout, not a fight, but a slow, cruel unraveling. I'd start with whispers, rumors at the library, hints at the shop. I'd let the town do the work, let their own lies choke them. And when they thought it couldn't get worse, I'd pull the final thread. I looked at Emily over coffee, her tired eyes, her forced smile, and felt nothing but the weight of what was coming. She'd chosen this. Now she'd live it. The air in our house felt thicker now, heavy with the unspoken. Emily moved through her days like a marionette, her strings pulled by guilt she didn't yet name. I watched her over breakfast, her hands fidgeting with her mug, her eyes darting to the clock. She was late again today, mumbling about a staff meeting. I nodded, kissed her cheek, and let her go. The moment her car pulled away, I went to work. Not in my shop, but on her world. The library was her kingdom, a place where she shone, and I'd start there, chipping away at the foundation. I drove into town, parked near the library, and walked in like any other patron. The head librarian, Margaret, knew me. Emily's quiet husband, the carpenter who fixed their shelves last spring. I smiled, asked about a book, then slipped into casual chatter. Emily's been so busy lately, I said, my tone light. All those late nights. Hope she's not overdoing it. Margaret frowned, puzzled. Late nights? We've been closing at 5 since the budget cuts. My chest tightened, but I kept my face soft, surprised. Oh, must have mixed up her schedule. She's always rushing around. Margaret nodded, but I saw the seed take root. Doubt. A tiny crack in Emily's perfect image. I didn't stop there. I visited the market, the coffee shop, the places where library staff gossiped. I dropped hints, vague but sharp. Emily's exhaustion, her extra hours, her distracted air. I didn't accuse, I planted questions, let others fill the blanks. By noon, I overheard 2 clerks whispering about her mystery project. Good. Let it spread. Let her feel the eyes, the murmurs. I went home, cooked dinner, and waited for her to return. Her face flushed from wherever she'd been. She didn't mention the library. I didn't ask. The silence between us was a weapon now, and I wielded it well. That night I turned to Tom. His shop was next, his pride and livelihood. I'd already nudged my friend at the county office. By morning, he'd call me with dirt. I sat in my workshop, the air thick with sawdust, and planned. The gambling rumor was a start, but I needed more. Something to twist the knife. I thought about his customers, his reputation, the way he swaggered through town. I could take that swagger, turn it to shame. I sketched ideas, not on paper but in my mind, each one colder, crueler than the last. Emily slept beside me, her breathing uneven. I stared at the ceiling, the cold thing inside me humming. I wasn't the man she'd married anymore. I was something else, a craftsman of ruin. She'd chosen Tom, built a secret life, and now I'd build one too, a mirror to hers, but darker. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to see it clearer. Her fall, his collapse, a reckoning they'd never forget. The call came at dawn. My friend from the county office had dug into Tom's shop. Nothing major, but enough. A lapsed permit, a few unpaid fines, a health inspection he'd dodged last year. Sloppy guy, my friend said. One complaint, and they'd audit him hard. I thanked him, hung up, and smiled into my coffee. Sloppy was perfect. I could work with that. I showered, dressed, and drove to the butcher shop, my truck idling across the street. Tom was there, apron on, chatting with a customer. I watched, my hands steady, my mind sharp. I didn't go in. Instead, I called the health department from a burner phone I'd bought weeks ago. Untraceable, anonymous. I got sick after eating at Harrison's, I said, my voice rough, unfamiliar. Meat smelled off. Thought you should know. They asked for details. I gave enough to sound real, not enough to pin me down. I hung up, tossed the phone into a dumpster, and drove away. By afternoon, I saw an inspector's van outside his shop. Tom stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his face red. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. It was starting. At home, Emily was distracted, her phone buzzing more than usual. She didn't say why, but I saw her texting, her thumbs quick, her brow furrowed. Tom, I guessed, rattled by the visit. I cooked pasta, poured wine, and asked about her day. Fine, she said, too sharp. I nodded, let it drop. She didn't know I'd lit the match, that the fire was creeping toward them both. After dinner, I went to my workshop, sanded a plank until my arms ached, and thought about the library. The rumors were simmering there. I'd fan them next. The following day, I upped the stakes. I printed flyers, simple, cheap, anonymous, claiming Tom's shop sold bad meat. Check your fridge, they read. Harrison's cuts corners. I slipped them under windshields at the market, the bar, the church parking lot. By evening, I heard whispers at the gas station. Tom's in trouble again. Perfect. Let him scramble, let him sweat. I wanted him off balance when the real blow came. Emily came home late, her eyes tired, her voice clipped. Rough day, she muttered, collapsing onto the couch. I rubbed her shoulders, my hands gentle, my heart stone. What happened? I asked, soft as a whisper. She waved it off, just work. And I let her lie. I didn't need her words anymore. I had her actions, her secrets, and soon her ruin. In bed, I lay awake, plotting the next move, the cold thing inside me singing. The library was buzzing by midweek. I'd kept the rumors alive, dropping hints to Margaret's assistant, a chatty woman named Claire. Emily's been so secretive, I said over coffee at the cafe, my tone worried. Hope she's okay. Claire's eyes widened. She loved a story. By Friday, I heard it echoed back. Something's up with Emily. She's not herself. Those late nights. The staff was turning, their trust fraying, and Emily felt it. She came home Friday night, pale, snapping at me over nothing. A spilled glass, a loud TV. I stayed calm, let her unravel. Tom's shop took a harder hit. The inspection turned up violations, dirty coolers, expired tags, and word spread fast, fueled by my flyers. Customers dwindled. I saw it driving by, the empty lot, the closed early sign. He was bleeding money now, his swagger gone. I imagined him calling Emily, their hushed panic, and it fed me. I wasn't done. I dug into his gambling past, found a name, Ricky, a loan shark he'd owed years ago. I tracked Ricky down, a gruff man at a dive bar, and slipped him a tip. Tom's flush again. Might be worth a visit. Ricky grinned, nodded. I left no trace. At home, I tightened the noose. I left more notes, innocent to her, damning in my mind. Grove was quiet today, I'd say, watching her flinch. She stopped sleeping well, her eyes shadowed, her excuses thin. I cooked her favorites, played the doting husband, and let her drown in it. She didn't suspect me. She thought it was fate, bad luck, her own guilt. I liked that. I wanted her to feel trapped before she knew why. Saturday, I saw Tom at the Rusty Nail, his face drawn, arguing with a man I recognized, Ricky. I stayed in my truck, watched the shouting, the shove. Tom stormed off, Ricky laughing. The debt was back. I'd bet. A ghost I'd summoned. I drove home, the cold thing inside me purring. Emily was out. Book club, she said, and I knew where she was. I didn't follow. I sat in my workshop, sharpened tools, and waited. The pieces were falling, and I was the hand guiding them. Sunday, she broke. I might quit the library, she said over breakfast, her voice small. Too much stress. I tilted my head, feigned concern. What's wrong? She shook it off, but I saw the cracks, her sanctuary slipping. I nodded, poured her coffee, and hid my triumph. Tom's world was crumbling, hers was next, and I was just getting started. Emily's unraveling was a quiet thing, a slow bleed I watched with cold satisfaction. She stopped humming, stopped smiling at strangers. The library rumors had grown legs. Margaret called her in for a chat. Claire told me later, her voice dripping with glee. They're questioning her hours, her commitment, she said. I nodded, thanked her for the coffee, and drove home. Emily didn't tell me about the meeting, but I saw it in her slumped shoulders, her bitten nails. She was losing her grip, and I was the shadow pushing her over the edge. Tom's shop was a husk now. The health department slapped him with a fine, a 30-day closure looming if he didn't fix the violations. Customers vanished, spooked by the flyers and the whispers. My whispers. Ricky was circling, too. I saw his car outside Tom's house one night, engine idling, a threat in the dark. I didn't feel sorry for him. He'd taken something mine, built a life on my wreckage, and now I was dismantling his. I drove by the shop daily, the closed sign a trophy, and planned the next strike. I turned the screws at home. I started leaving the radio on, tuned to a station that played love songs, soft, mocking reminders of her betrayal. She'd wince, change it, but I'd switch it back when she wasn't looking. I'd mention Tom casually, heard his shop struggling, poor guy, and watch her freeze, her excuses stumbling. She was a trapped animal now, eyes darting, and I was the hunter, patient, precise. I didn't yell, didn't accuse. I let her drown in the unsaid. One night she snapped. "Why are you so calm?" she asked, her voice shrill, her hands trembling. "Everything's falling apart, and you're just fine." I looked at her, my face blank, and shrugged. "I've got you," I said, soft as a blade. She stared, then turned away, tears welling. She didn't know I was the storm, that I'd orchestrated every gust tearing through her life. I went to my workshop, sanded a plank until my hands ached, and smiled into the silence. She was breaking and I was the fracture. By week's end, I heard Tom was selling his truck, desperate, strapped. Emily's phone buzzed less. I guessed he was pulling away, or she was. I didn't care. I wanted them both to feel the weight, the isolation. I sat in the grove one last time, the air cold, the grass dead underfoot. I imagined them here, laughing, touching, and let the cold thing inside me roar. This wasn't enough. I needed more. A final blow, something to sear them both. I drove home, the plan sharpening, and waited for the moment. The endgame came into focus on a Monday, gray and bitter. Emily quit the library that morning. She didn't tell me, but Claire did, her voice hushed over the phone. "She just walked out, James. Said she couldn't take it." I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the wall. Her sanctuary was gone, her pride shattered, and I'd barely lifted a finger. The town had done it for me, their whispers a chorus I'd conducted. I cooked dinner, steak, rare, a nod to Tom's ruin, and waited for her to come home, her face a mask of defeat. She didn't speak when she walked in, just dropped her bag and sank onto the couch. "Rough day?" I asked, my tone gentle. She nodded, eyes distant, and I let her sit in it. I plated the steak, set it before her, and watched her pick at it, her appetite gone. "I quit," she said finally, her voice a whisper. "Couldn't handle the pressure." I tilted my head, feigned surprise. "You loved that job." She shrugged, tears slipping, and I handed her a napkin, my hand steady. Inside, the cold thing danced. Tom's collapse was louder. His shop shut down that week, the for sale sign a white flag. Ricky had come calling. I saw the bruises on Tom's face at the bar, his head low, his spirit broken. I'd tipped the scales, summoned the ghosts of his past, and now he was paying. I drove by his house, saw the lights off, the yard unkempt. He was alone, I knew it, just as Emily was alone now, even with me beside her. I'd stripped them bare, and they didn't even see my hand in it. I tightened the final knot. I wrote a letter, anonymous, typed, detailing their affair, the grove, the motel. I mailed copies to Margaret, to Tom's landlord, to the bar owner at the Rusty Nail. I didn't sign it, didn't need to. The truth was enough. Twisted just so, a blade in the dark. By Friday, the town was buzzing. Emily's name, Tom's name, tangled in a scandal I'd set loose. She came home crying, her phone dead, her friends silent. "They know," she sobbed. "Someone told them." I held her, my arms a cage, my voice soft. "It'll pass," I lied, and she clung to me, not knowing I was the storm's eye. Tom left town that night. I saw his truck loaded, speeding out. Emily stayed, broken, mine again, but not the way she thought. I'd won, and the cold thing inside me was quiet at last. The house was a tomb now, silent except for Emily's muffled sobs echoing from the bedroom. She'd barely left the couch since the letter hit town, her world reduced to a pile of tissues and unanswered calls. I moved around her like a specter, cooking meals she didn't eat, offering words she didn't hear. "It'll be okay," I'd say, my voice a hollow comfort, and she'd nod, her eyes glassy, her spirit gone. The town had turned on her. Margaret's cold dismissal, Claire's smug whispers, the library patron's sideways glances. She was a pariah now, and I was the architect of her exile. Tom was gone, his truck vanishing into the night like a wounded animal fleeing the hunter. I heard whispers at the gas station. Ricky had collected, the shop was foreclosed, and Tom had nothing left to his name. I pictured him on some dusty road, alone, the weight of his choices crushing him. I didn't feel pity. He'd taken my wife, my trust, and I'd taken everything else. The cold thing inside me wasn't gone. It was sated, coiled, watching from the shadows as I walked through the wreckage I'd made. I kept up the act at home. I'd sit with Emily, stroke her hair, let her lean into me like I was her savior. She didn't know I'd written the letter, didn't know I'd whispered to Ricky, didn't know I'd called the health department. She thought it was fate, a cruel twist, and I let her believe it. "Why me?" she'd ask, her voice breaking, and I'd shrug, my face soft. "Sometimes things just fall apart," I'd say, and she'd cry harder, not seeing the truth in my hands. I liked that, her blindness, her dependence. It was a victory sharper than any shout. The town kept talking. I'd hear it at the market, the cafe, the hardware store. Emily and that butcher. Poor James. What a mess. They pitied me, praised my patience, and I nodded, played the wounded husband with a quiet grace. It was perfect. They'd built the narrative I wanted. A story where I was the victim, not the blade. I'd go home, cook dinner, and watch Emily shrink, her pride dust, her life ash. The cold thing hummed, a low note of triumph. I wasn't done, though. I had one last thread to pull, one final knot to tie. I drove to the Grove that night, the air sharp with frost, and buried a box, a time capsule of their betrayal. Photos I'd taken, the note from her coat, a receipt from the motel. I marked the spot with a stone, a silent promise that this wasn't over until I said it was. I'd show her one day, when the time was right, and let her see the depth of my craft. For now, I went home, the dirt still on my hands, and slept beside her, dreamless. Weeks passed, and Emily became a ghost of herself, haunting our house in a bathrobe, her hair unwashed, her eyes dull. She didn't work, didn't leave, didn't fight. The library had replaced her. Claire took her spot, I heard, and the town had moved on, their gossip fading to a murmur. I kept my routine, went to my carpentry jobs, came home to her silence. She'd stopped asking why, stopped crying, just sat there, a shell I'd hollowed out. I watched her over coffee, her hands trembling, and felt the cold thing settle deeper, a permanent tenant now. I checked on Tom's ruin once more. A friend at the bar said he'd surfaced in a town 50 miles away, working odd jobs, living in a trailer. Ricky had broken his nose, taken his last dime, and the butcher was a nobody now, a shadow of the man who'd laughed with my wife. I nodded, thanked my friend, and drove home, the news a quiet ember in my chest. He was gone but not forgotten. I'd made sure his name was mud here, a cautionary tale. That was enough for now. At home, I started leaving hints, testing her. I'd hum a tune they'd played at the diner, mention the Grove in passing. Need to clear some brush there, and watch her flinch, her breath catching. She didn't ask, didn't accuse, but I saw the fear flicker, the doubt. I wanted her to wonder, to feel the edges of my shadow without knowing its shape. One night, I left a photo on the counter, an old one of us at the Grove, smiling. She stared at it, her face pale, and said nothing. I smiled, poured her tea, and let the silence cut. I rebuilt my life around her ruin. I took on bigger projects, earned praise from clients, let the town see me thrive. Strong guy, that James, they'd say, and I'd nod, my mask perfect. Emily stayed home, a prisoner of her own making, and I let her. She'd chosen this, I told myself, her and Tom, their secret, their lie. I'd only given it back, wrapped in thorns. In my workshop, I carved a small figure, a woman, head bowed, and set it on the shelf, a trophy of my craft. She broke again one night, her voice small. "Do you still love me?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. I looked at her, the woman I'd once adored, now a stranger I'd unmade. "Always," I said, my voice steady, my heart ice. She nodded, tears falling, and I held her, my arms a lie. The cold thing inside me laughed, soft and low, as she clung to the man who'd destroyed her. Spring came, the air warming, the trees budding, but our house stayed cold, a mausoleum for what we'd been. Emily tried to claw her way back, applied for a clerk job at the grocery store, started showering again. But the town wouldn't let her forget. "That's her," they'd whisper, and she'd come home, defeated, her fight fading. I watched, my face a mask of concern, my hands clean of the dirt I'd sown. She didn't know I'd tipped the store manager. A quiet word about her past, enough to keep her out. She'd stay mine, broken, dependent. I heard Tom was drinking now, his trailer a wreck, his name a slur in that distant town. A friend sent me a photo. Tom, gaunt, unshaven, hauling trash for cash. I studied it, the cold thing purring, and burned it in my workshop, the smoke curling like a prayer. He'd never come back, never touch her again, and that was my victory. I didn't need to see him suffer. I knew he did, and that was enough. I turned my focus to Emily, the final piece of my design. I started showing her the edges of my revenge, subtle at first. I'd leave the radio on a station that played ads for Harrison's old shop, now a laundromat, and watch her tense. I'd drive her past the Grove, slow down, let her squirm. "Pretty spot," I'd say, and she'd nod, her hands twisting in her lap. She didn't ask, didn't dare, but I saw the questions in her eyes, the fear growing. I wanted her to feel it, the walls closing, the truth creeping, and I savored every flinch. One day I took her to my workshop, showed her the carved figure. "Looks like you," I said, my tone light, and she stared, her breath shallow. "Why?" she whispered, and I shrugged. Felt right. She didn't touch it, didn't speak, just left the room, her steps unsteady. I let her go, the cold thing humming. She was starting to see, starting to wonder, and that was the cruelest cut. Not knowing but suspecting, forever. At night, I'd lie beside her, her body rigid, and plan the final reveal. I'd kept the box in the Grove, the proof of her betrayal, and soon I'd show her. Not yet. She wasn't ready, wasn't broken enough. I wanted her to beg for forgiveness first, to need me so much she'd take the truth and still stay. I closed my eyes, the cold thing a heartbeat, and waited for her to crumble. Summer burned bright, the sun relentless, but Emily faded, her skin pale, her voice a whisper. She got the clerk job after all, the manager relented, but quit in a week, the stares too much, the whispers too loud. She stayed home again, gardening now, her hands in the dirt like she could bury what she'd done. I watched from the porch, coffee in hand, and let her try. She'd never outrun it, I'd made sure of that. The town remembered, and I kept the memory alive. A quiet word here, a nod there. I checked on Tom one last time. A contact said he'd been arrested, drunk, fighting in a bar, no money for bail. He'd rot in a cell for a while, a fitting end for the man who'd thought he could take my life and walk away. I didn't celebrate, didn't need to. His ruin was complete, a footnote in my story, and I turned back to Emily, the main act. She was close now, teetering, and I was ready to push her over. I started leaving bigger hints. I'd play a voicemail from Margaret on speaker. Emily's hours never added up, and watch her freeze, her excuses gone. I'd leave the car keys by a map, the Grove circled, and see her hands shake. She didn't ask, didn't confront, but I saw the cracks widen, the fear deepen. One night, she woke screaming, a nightmare she wouldn't share, and I held her, my voice soft, my heart stone. "What's wrong?" I asked, and she shook her head, tears soaking the pillow. I smiled into the dark, the cold thing roaring. The next day, I took her to the Grove. "Let's walk," I said, and she followed, reluctant, her steps slow. We reached the clearing, the air thick with memory, and I stopped by the stone. "Buried something here once?" I said, casual, and her eyes widened, her breath catching. "What?" she whispered, and I shrugged. "Old stuff. Memories." She stared at the stone, then at me, and I saw it, the dawning, the terror. I didn't dig it up, didn't need to. She knew something was there, something damning, and that was enough. At home, she broke fully. "What do you know?" she asked, her voice raw, her hands gripping mine. I looked at her, my face calm, my eyes cold. "What do you think I know?" I said, and she sobbed, collapsing into me. "I'm sorry," she choked, and I held her, my victory complete. She didn't know the half of it, but she'd feel it, forever. The cold thing inside me was quiet, satisfied, as I whispered, "It's okay." A lie sharper than any truth. Fall came, the leaves crimson, the air sharp, and Emily was mine again, but not the way she'd been. She clung to me, fragile, desperate, her guilt a chain I'd forged. She didn't garden anymore, didn't leave the house unless I took her. Her world shrunk to me and the walls I'd built. I'd won. She was broken, Tom was gone, and I stood taller, the town's quiet hero, the man who'd endured. They didn't see the cold thing, didn't know the hands that shaped this end. I kept it hidden, my masterpiece. One night, I dug up the box. Emily was asleep, medicated now, her dreams dulled by pills. I brought it home, laid it on the kitchen table. Photos, notes, receipts, a map of her betrayal. I didn't wake her, didn't show her yet. I sat with it, the weight of my work in my hands, and felt the cold thing stir one last time. I'd show her soon, when she was strong enough to face it, weak enough to stay. She'd see my craft, my revenge, and know I'd never let her forget. Tom faded from the story, a jailbird, a memory, irrelevant. I heard he'd lost the trailer, drifted north, a ghost of himself. I didn't care. He'd paid, and Emily had paid, and I was whole or close to it. The town moved on, their pity for me a quiet song, and I let it play. I worked my jobs, carved my wood, lived my life, Emily at my side, a shadow I'd shaped. She asked once, her voice small, "Why do you stay?" I looked at her, the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd unmade, and smiled. "Because you're mine," I said, and she nodded, tears falling. She didn't know the box, didn't know the Grove's secret, but she felt it, a weight she'd carry always. I held her, my arms a cage, my heart ice, and the cold thing inside me slept, its work done. Years later, I'd show her the box, watch her crumble again, and build her back, piece by piece, in my image. For now, I lived, she suffered, and the story ended where I wanted. Me standing, them fallen, a revenge so cruel it was art. The Grove stayed quiet, the town forgot, and I remained, the craftsman of their ruin, forever.